Imagine you want to open a bank in the Middle Ages, not a modern one with apps and credit scores and glass towers, but a real working bank in a city like Florence, Bruges, Venice, or Genoa 700 years ago. And now think about what that actually meant, because the answer looks nothing like what you probably picture. To run a bank in medieval Europe was to live inside a strange and beautiful contradiction. The church had banned the very act that makes a bank, and yet some of the richest families in European history built their entire fortunes on top of it. So the real question is not whether you could own a bank, it is how you could possibly make money doing something the law of the time called a sin. And the answer, which this video walks through brick by brick with real numbers from the historical record, turns out to be one of the cleverest financial puzzles ever solved. So let us start at the very beginning, with why medieval bankers even existed. The medieval economy was built on trade, on wool from England, cloth from Flanders, silk and spices from the East, wine from France. And all of this trade moved across enormous distances. But the money itself was a problem because every city and every ruler minted their own coins. A florin from Florence, a ducat from Venice, a pound from England, a groat from the Low Countries, and each of these coins had a slightly different weight, purity, and value. So the first job of any banker was simply to exchange one currency for another, and this is where the word bank itself comes from. The Italian word banco, meaning bench or table, because the earliest money changers literally sat at wooden benches in the market squares, weighing coins and counting them out. And if a money changer failed, his bench was smashed, which is where we get the word bankrupt from banca rota, the broken bench. So the very language of modern finance is a memory of medieval market squares. But the deeper problem was that nobody wanted. To carry heavy bags of gold and silver across mountains and seas, a merchant traveling from Florence to London in the 1400s did not want to haul thousands of coins through bandit country, so the bankers invented something far more elegant, the bill of exchange. Here's how it worked. A merchant would hand a sum of money to a banker in one city, and the banker would write out a paper promise instructing his partner in another city to pay that money out in the local currency at a future date. And this single piece of paper did two things at once. It moved value across distance without moving a single coin, and it created a legal way to earn money without openly charging interest, because the exchange rate between the two currencies, fixed the day the bill was written, was almost never the same as the rate when the bill was finally paid. So the banker who sold the bill could quietly make a profit on the difference. And because these bills could be traded freely from hand to hand, they became an early form of paper money and a genuine financial instrument in their own right. This was the great workaround, because charging interest, which the church called usury, was forbidden. The church held that money should not breed money, that a loan should return exactly what was given and nothing more. And the official position was blunt and had been for centuries. Whatever exceeds the principal is usury, so a banker could not simply say, "Lend me 1,000 and I will pay you back 1,100," but he could sell you a bill of exchange and let the slow drift of exchange rates do the work for him, which was usury in spirit but not in letter. And that distinction made all the difference. And it is worth pausing to appreciate just how completely this one rule shaped the entire financial system, because it meant that medieval bankers could never be honest about what they were doing. Their entire profession was a careful dance around a prohibition, and the cleverest of them never touched the forbidden thing directly. They simply made the market itself pay them. To understand how much money could be made this way, look at a documented example from the Medici Bank, which was the single largest and most respected bank in 15th century Europe on a day in July of the year 1441. The Medici branch in Venice bought a bill of exchange on Bruges at a rate of 54.5 groats for every Venetian ducat. 2 months later, when the bill came due, they received those 54.5 groats in Bruges for each ducat. And then the Bruges branch, acting for Venice, used those very proceeds to buy a bill back to Venice at a rate of 51.5 groats per ducat. And when that second bill matured 2 months after that, the whole round trip had taken 4 months and had earned 3 groats of profit on every single ducat. With no coin ever physically crossing a border, that is the medieval bank in miniature, value moving, rates drifting, and profit quietly appearing in the middle. And notice that nobody on either side ever admitted to charging interest. The profit simply lived in the gap between one exchange rate and another. Now, who could actually own such a bank? In medieval Florence, banking was organized as a guild, the Arte del Cambio, the Guild of Money Changers. And membership was everything, because the guild set the rules, protected the members, and gave the whole enterprise an air of legitimacy, and the numbers tell a striking story about how crowded and competitive that world was. In the year 1399, the records of the guild list about 71 member banks. By 1460, that number had fallen to 33. And by the early 1500s, the great banking houses of Florence had been reduced to roughly 9. So banking, even in its golden age, was an intensely fragile business. Most banks were small, and many did not survive their founders. The profession was a churn, and only a very few firms ever managed to endure long enough to become truly enormous. The famous giants who came before the Medici were the Bardi and the Peruzzi, two Florentine houses that dominated European finance in the early 1300s, and their story is the single most important warning in the history of banking, because they made the mistake that every banker since has feared. They lent enormous sums to a king, King Edward III of England, to help finance his campaigns, and when that king could not repay, the loans collapsed, and so did the banks. The default is remembered as one of the great financial catastrophes of the medieval world, hundreds of thousands of gold florins simply vanishing from the European economy. And the lesson it burned into every banker who came after was that lending to a ruler was the surest possible way to ruin, because a king who owes you money can always choose not to pay, and there's no court in the world that can force a monarch to settle his debts. So the Bardi and the Peruzzi became a cautionary tale that shaped banking strategy for generations. The Medici family watched this happen and built their entire system around not repeating it. And the way they did it is genuinely fascinating as an economics lesson. First, they never put all their money into one enterprise. The bank was not one giant firm, but a network of separate partnerships. Each branch in each city was its own legal partnership with its own partners and its own books, and the central family held the controlling share in every one of them. So a disaster in London did not automatically drag down the branch in Rome. And this is precisely why historians often compare the medieval Medici Bank to a modern holding company. Second, they understood that in banking, reputation was the true currency. They built a name for reliability and honest dealing so strong that the most powerful institution in Europe, the papacy, chose to trust them with its money, and the relationship with the church is the real key to understanding how a medieval bank made serious money. Because the Pope collected revenues from across the entire Christian world, tithes, taxes, offerings, and all of that money had to be gathered in from the far corners of Europe and moved to the center. And who better to do it than a bank with branches everywhere? The Medici effectively became the fiscal agents of the Holy See, handling and moving papal revenues across the continent. And this was stupendously profitable because the church did not pay an awkward interest. It paid in deposits, and consider the scale. In the year 1427, the Roman branch of the Medici Bank held about 100,000 gold florins on deposit from the papal curia, while the total capitalization of the entire Medici Bank at roughly the same time was only about 25,000 gold florins. In other words, the deposits parked with the Pope's bankers were worth several times the bank's entire invested capital. That is the medieval version of what we would call leverage. And it is why the Roman branch alone could account for more than 60% of the bank's profits in some years. The safest and most powerful client in Christendom was also the one that brought in the most money. To grasp what a single gold florin was actually worth in that world, the numbers help. The Medici Bank was founded in the year 1397 by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. And getting that date exactly right matters, because the whole point of a history about numbers is that the numbers must be true. Giovanni started the bank with his partners by raising 10,000 gold florins of capital, and from that modest base the firm grew into a genuine European empire. At its peak it had branches in Rome, Venice, Milan, Pisa, Geneva, Lyon, Avignon, London, and Bruges, and yet the entire operation ran on a remarkably small staff. At various points, the whole bank employed only a few dozen people, with one account placing the total workforce at roughly 40 employees. So this was not a corporation with thousands of workers. It was a tight, elite network of trusted agents sitting in a handful of cities, moving enormous sums purely on the strength of their word and their ledgers. The economics of who got paid in such a firm are themselves a lesson in how to run a business. The Medici did not pay their branch managers a simple salary. Instead, each manager was treated as an investor who put his own money into the branch, and he was paid not a wage but a share of the profits. Take the example of the Venice branch in 1455. The partnership was renewed and the manager invested 2,000 ducats out of a total partnership of 14,000. So his fair share of the money was 1/7. But because of how the deal was written, he was actually entitled to 1/5 of the profits. A reward for taking on the role and the risk, this structure meant that every manager had a direct and personal stake in the success of his branch. His own money was on the table right alongside the family's, and his reward rose and fell with performance. It was an incentive system built 300 years before people began studying incentive systems as a science. And what were those managers actually selling? The products of a medieval bank were simple compared to today. There were demand deposits and time deposits, where a merchant stored his money safely and could draw on it at need. There were discretionary deposits, a clever middle ground that paid a return without openly being called interest. And there were those bills of exchange which were the real engine of the whole machine. And on top of the pure finance, the big banks also traded in physical goods: wool, cloth, silk, even alum, the mineral essential for dyeing cloth. The articles of partnership for a Medici branch usually declared the purpose to be dealing in exchange and in merchandise with the help of God and of good fortune. And that little phrase captures both the soaring optimism and the deep risk of the entire enterprise. Everything depended on trust, on timing, and on the markets holding steady. But the darkest corner of the system, and the one most people do not expect, is that the institutions serving the wealthy were matched by an entirely separate world. Serving the poor, pawn shops. In Florence, these were known as banks of pledge, and they were a world apart from the polished merchant banks. They were explicitly excluded from the money changers guild. They were socially shunned for openly doing what the merchant banks only did in secret, and the law allowed a licensed pawnbroker to charge up to 20% a year on loans secured by a borrower's possessions. So the pawnshops were technically illegal under church teaching on usury, but the city tolerated them by imposing a collective fine each and every year, a fine that functioned in practice as a simple license to operate. So even in the strictly moral world of medieval finance, there was a legal space carved out for the poor to borrow, and for the lender to be compensated for the risk. There were also remarkable public experiments in medieval banking that show how far the whole idea had spread. Beyond the private merchant houses in Genoa, the Great Bank of St. George, the Casa di San Giorgio, was established in 1407 and became one of the earliest public banks in history, run to manage the Republic's finances and its debts. In Venice, a long tradition of the state, engaging with banking culminated in the famous public bank of the Rialto, the Banco di Rialto, which opened at the very end of the 16th century in 1587 and became a model for public banking across Europe for centuries to come. And there were also the so-called Mountains of Piety, the Monti di Pietà, charitable lending institutions founded by the Franciscans beginning in the 1460s, which offered small loans to the poor at very low cost, precisely to push back against the high rates of the private pawnbrokers. So the medieval financial world was not one single thing. It was a whole ecosystem, from humble pawnshops to private merchant empires to public state banks, each serving a different customer under a different set of rules. Now, there is one earlier chapter to this story that deserves its own mention, and that is the rise and fall of the Knights Templar who, in the 12th and 13th centuries, became something very close to the first true international bankers. Because pilgrims traveling to the holy places needed a way to carry value safely, and the Templars, with their network of fortified houses across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, offered exactly that. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar house in his home country and draw on it later at another Templar house far away, which was essentially a primitive system of deposit. And transfer banking, and popes and kings alike kept their treasure with the Templars. So the order effectively became a bank that wore armor and fought in wars, and their wealth and independence grew so great and stirred so much envy and fear among the powerful that the order was eventually dissolved in the early 1400s. A stark reminder, if one were ever needed, that in the Middle Ages being the richest banker in the world did not always protect you from those who wanted what you had. Now let us return to scale, because it is easy to say the Medici were rich and leave it at that, but the actual numbers ground it in reality when the founder, Giovanni de' Medici, reached the end of his long stewardship, which came in 1429. His fortune was valued at roughly 180,000 gold florins. That is 18 times the 10,000 florins he had started with, about 30 years before, an extraordinary rate of growth for an era without computers, without stock markets, and without the modern idea of compound interest on a bank account. And the family continued to pour enormous sums into politics, into art, and into patronage. The family itself reported that between 1434 and 1471 they spent, on average, about 17,467 gold florins every single year, which gives a real sense of how much money rushed through this one household. And historians are careful to warn that converting these medieval fortunes into modern money is nearly impossible and deeply imprecise, because so much of the wealth sat in land, in art, in buildings, and in gold, holdings that simply do not translate cleanly into a number in today's dollars. And yet, for all of its brilliance, medieval banking was remarkably fragile. And the second half of the Medici story is a masterclass in how even the best-run financial institution on the continent could be undone by the same mistakes that had destroyed the Bardi and the Peruzzi. Because the temptation to lend to royal courts was simply too strong to resist, the London branch lent heavily to King Edward IV of England. And when the crown strained under war, the debts could not be collected. The English king alone was recorded as owing the London branch about £10,500 sterling, the English nobility another 1,000 or so, and still more was tied up in goods sent out on consignment. When the London branch was finally wound down in 1478, its total losses had reached about 51,533 gold florins, and one document records that the losses connected to the collapse of the Bruges branch, which had absorbed the London debt, came to more than 70,000 gold florins. A figure the historical sources themselves call optimistic, because it assumes every asset on the books was really worth what the book said. It was the same pattern, repeated in Milan, where a brilliant branch manager loaned vast sums to the ruling Sforza court, and the Duke himself left unpaid debts that reached about 179,000 ducats, an enormous amount by any measure. And the famously ambitious manager of the Bruges branch, a man named Tommaso Portinari, was so eager to please the Burgundian court that he blew straight past his own lending limits. The records show the partnership agreement forbade him from lending more than £6,000 groat in total. Yet the bad debts owed to the branch by one ruler alone, Charles the Bold, reached about £16,150 groat, more than 2.5 times the legal limit. So time and again the bankers who got into trouble were not the cautious ones, quietly moving bills of exchange, but the ambitious ones who convinced themselves that a king would make them rich. And the pattern is so consistent across centuries and across cities that it looks less like bad luck and more like a structural law of the entire system. When you lend to power, power does not really owe you anything. It does not want to give. There was also a quieter, slower force eating away at the medieval banks, and that was the value of money itself. Between the 1470s and the 1480s, gold tended to fall in value relative to silver, partly because of rising output from the silver mines of Germany and Bohemia. And for a bank whose deposits were held and paid out in gold, this slow drift in the precious metals was bad news. The florin was so trusted, so stable, and so admired across Europe that Florence refused to debase it, which was a point of pride and reliability, but it meant the bank quietly bore the cost whenever the gold it had promised to repay became, in real terms, slightly less valuable than the gold it had taken in. Monetary drift is not a sudden collapse. It is a slow and patient squeeze, and the great banks of Florence and other cities felt it for years. Remember that the membership of the Florentine Banking Guild fell from about 71 banks in 1399 to 33 by 1460, and many of those banks did not vanish in a dramatic crash, but were simply squeezed out of existence by a combination of bad loans, fierce competition, and the slow tightening of the metal underneath their feet. Still, the medieval bank was a genuinely world-changing invention, and its greatest gift was not any single product but the very idea of credit. The idea that a promise written on paper could move across borders and be honored, that a reputation built on years of honest dealing could be worth more than a chest of gold, that a man in Venice could settle a debt in London without either man ever touching a coin. This was the infrastructure that made the Renaissance possible because art, architecture, scholarship, and exploration all needed money to move, and money moved because bankers had earned the right to be trusted, and double-entry bookkeeping, which the Medici Bank helped to perfect, became the universal language of all modern finance. Every debit and every credit, every balance sheet, every quarterly report issued by a modern corporation descends in a direct line from the ledgers that medieval clerks kept by hand. And the very words bank and bankrupt carry the memory of those wooden benches and broken tables in the market squares of Florence. When the end finally came for the Medici Bank, it came not with a single dramatic event, but with the slow unwinding of an empire. By the 1490s, the bank had already shrunk from its peak, and in 1494, when the family's political power in Florence collapsed, the remaining branches were dissolved and the bank's surviving records were seized. And even at its moment of decline, it was still the biggest bank in Europe, with at least 7 branches still standing and more than 50 factors and agents in the field. So the greatest medieval banking house came to its end while still ranked as the largest firm on the continent, undone not by being small, but by being too deeply entangled with the politics and the princes it had trusted. And the fact that so few of its records survived means that even today historians can only piece together fragments of its true story, which only makes the numbers we do have feel more precious. Every florin and every groat that survives in a document is a small window into a vanished world. So what does all of this mean for us today? Nothing prescriptive, and certainly nothing that should ever be read as advice about anyone's own money or anyone's own ambitions. The point of medieval history is not to tell you what to do with your savings or how to build a fortune. It is to show you how the mental machinery of money was actually built. And there is something quietly profound in that. The medieval banker solved an almost impossible puzzle: how to earn from lending while the law forbade lending for profit. And they solved it not by cheating, but by invention, by bills of exchange, by partnerships, by reputation, and by the slow, patient building of trust. And every time you swipe a card, or send a payment, or tap your phone to transfer money across the world in an instant, you are standing on the bench of a Florentine money changer who weighed gold coins and wrote promises in a ledger 700 years ago. Money has always run on trust, and the medieval bank is the place where modern finance first learned to trust, which, if you pause to think about it, is a rather wonderful thing to have built out of a broken bench and an honest name.